Anybody can make electronic music, right? Basically just pressing play on a laptop. You know, most of them can't even play real instruments. I used to be, well, sort of an insufferable snob when it came to electronic music. In my defense, I had just finished a master's degree in piano performance, and I'm pretty sure Elitism 604 was in the curriculum as an elective. Then I started getting interested in film scoring, and then how to make music with a computer, then synthesizers, then production. And a weird thing happened. My early electronic music kinda sucked. Maybe it was time to do something that they never taught me in my graduate elitism class, and certainly something that you're never supposed to do here on the internet: admit that I was wrong? For me, it was simply a lack of understanding in terms of what electronic music actually entails and what it takes to make it. It's not about virtuosity. It's not even about harmony and melody in many cases. It's a completely different way of putting sounds together. In the world I came from, the sound palette we had to work with was pretty well fixed. The primary variables were the notes themselves. And while most acoustic instruments can provide a fairly wide range of tones and timbres, there are still well-defined limits. While we can change texture and tone through technique and orchestration, it's really more like combining colors that already exist to make new colors. Much of electronic music, however, is much more reliant on texture and uses sound design and production to achieve most of the variation. Then it becomes about how you put those sounds together. If you take the time to craft your own sounds, it's less like painting and more like building your own canvas to paint on, building your own orchestra from the ground up. And that requires a new set of skills that was completely absent from my toolkit. Could play a mean Rachmaninoff prelude, though. Fast forward to about a decade's worth of time spent messing around with synths and samplers and DAWs and tape loops and pipe organs. That's a different video, actually. And I can now lose hours and even days to just making sounds. I love it. I love the process of finding new sounds. I love figuring out how to use those sounds in a new piece of music. I love it so much I don't even want AI to do it for me. Weird, right? But I can't deny my background, and because of it, I still have a deep love for composing with more traditional harmonies and melodies as well. You know, as I was sitting here experimenting with some ideas for a new project I'm starting to work on, it dawned on me why I had sort of a hard time marrying the traditional world that I came from with synthesis and electronic music. See, with the orchestra and more traditional, conventional instrumentation, we kind of have a long history of tradition and convention in terms of what sounds work well together, what timbres are going to complement one another and contrast one another really well. Here, you kind of have to do all of that yourself and let your ears guide you in terms of what works together, and you have a lot more variables to worry about. So I had this sort of weird FM, gnarly, evolving patch going on, and I was going to improvise with the Iridium with another patch that I had set up. And what I found was that they were both just too busy. They both occupy too much of the same space. See, by itself, that Iridium patch is pretty cool. But it's just too busy. There's too much going on that interferes with what's happening here. I think this is one reason why I often just go to the piano or the Rhodes or something that is just constant and I know what's going to happen when I put it with something evolving and kind of chaotic. just have one variable instead of two sets of variables that are competing for each other's attention. I remember my composition teacher warning me about composing for the organ. See, it's all tying in together. Because in his opinion, a lot of organ music kinda sucks. His theory was that it's really easy to get lost in the majestic sound of the instrument and how impressive it is to play one because it's pretty freaking hard, and that could potentially mask some compositional weaknesses. I think that's a valid point, and I think that in electronic music the tools have gotten so good and the sound's so good that it's kind of easy to lose sight of the core ideas and core concepts that usually make music memorable. And there's a certain point where all that gear and all of those tools become more of a distraction than an inspiration, but maybe that's a subject for another video entirely. One thing that I think sort of interfered with my ability to make a seamless transition from these two worlds early on was feeling overwhelmed by just having seemingly unlimited options. Like there was just too much to choose from. I started out in the box in a DAW and was really overwhelmed by all of the choices that I had to make all of a sudden. So I had to learn to apply some of the stuff that I really already knew from the more traditional school of thought that I had come from to my electronic music. And one of those big things was self-imposed limitations in order to focus my music. So I started implementing some of those same concepts that I had learned writing for choirs, orchestras, chamber groups, even my own instruments like piano and organ. And it turns out that these relatively simple concepts are kind of universal, and they can be applied to a wide range of mediums. And they really sort of helped me get out of the weeds early on as I was trying to make the transition into electronic music. If you'd like to read more about those specific things and some of my favorites, I've compiled those into a free ebook, which I will leave linked in the description, should you choose to check it out. If you can make an idea work in black and white, say at the piano for example, then when you add the orchestration, it brings all of those really strong core ideas to life and enhances it, rather than relying on those things to make the piece work. And I do think that this is something that electronic musicians can learn from the classical world. There's a reason that those timeless concepts are timeless. They've stood the test of time for a reason. Since I was particularly interested in some more ambient textures and sound design, a lot of my early electronic music sounded like a washy, muddy mess. You know, grab an evolving pad preset and, throw some reverb at it, and we're done. And it took me an embarrassingly long time to realize that this wasn't how the ambient artists that I love the most were typically writing music. Their music seemed to have layers and texture to it, and everything seemed to have its own space. Eventually, I learned as I started getting into synthesis that there's a bit of a disconnect between sound design when making presets to show off all of the capabilities of a synth, and sound design intended to be used in a piece of music or a broader application. So how did these artists that I admired create this multi-dimensional sound where everything seemed to have its own place, its own space to live? And yet, all of them seem to work together to create something more powerful. Most presets are made to demonstrate what a synth or what a piece of software is capable of doing. They often take up most or all of the frequency spectrum with something shimmery on top, busy mids, and all of the sub that the synth can muster. These can be really fun to explore, and I've used them as a jumping off point in the past, but I find that they're often not the most useful in the actual music that I'm trying to make. When I do use presets, I find myself stripping them down, simplifying them so that they can exist with one another in a piece of music. So I guess maybe going back to my classical roots, this is a more orchestral approach to sound design where every layer has its own place to live and hopefully works well together with the other layers. They're not all competing for the same space. So if you're like I was and have trouble getting clarity and separation in your mixes, maybe back up to the sound design stage and see what you can simplify, what you can sort of narrow down to fit within its own specific area of the frequency spectrum. For me, creating more intentional and specific sounds, For me, creating more specific and intentional sounds with their own set of limitations solved a lot of the problems that I was trying to address later in the mixing stage with very limited success. So I think the sound design portion of the process is really important in electronic music. I think if you make your own sounds, you often create things that are more unique and more inspiring to you when you go to actually apply those things in your music, because they're the sounds that naturally inspire you to create, because you created the sounds. I got a little pushback from some people on a video I made last year about the issues with always relying on presets. And I do take those people's point, which was that a lot of times you can get so sucked into sound design that you don't actually get a lot of music written. Or if you have a deadline, it can certainly be a problem. But I still think that you miss out on a lot of sweet spots and things that you would never consider doing, sounds that could be potential jumping off points for pieces that you would never make without exploring those sweet spots and finding them through the process of making the sounds yourself. You sort of find stuff that you didn't even realize you were looking for, or you find something inspiring that you didn't even know would inspire you in a certain way. I found that I kind of get the best of both worlds when I divide up days on projects, so that there are a few days of just sound design where I'm building a library of my own unique sounds to use, and then another day or two of getting stuck in on the creative process of putting them together in interesting ways. And sometimes those sounds themselves can just inspire an entire piece of music on their own that I would have never come up with without those sounds. There are certain tracks of mine that would never have existed without spending a little time on some inspiring sound design elements that I could construct things around. And because they're my sounds, I find them more inspiring to create my music. So I'm always trying to find some sort of balance between my own love for production and for more traditional harmony and melody that is capable of telling its own story independent of the production and sound design. And over the years I've learned that you don't always have to have balance. You can let one or the other, either the sound design or the notes themselves, take center stage depending on what piece of music you're working on. So if you come from the more classical world like I have, maybe spend a little more time considering the sounds themselves and learn how to make some on your own. There's an entire world of inspiration waiting there that I never even considered for most of my life as a musician. And if you started out in a DAW with electronic music, maybe consider some of the classical concepts that have stood the test of time. Maybe if you implement some of those things, it can help your music stand out from the rest of the electronic music crowd just a bit. Those concepts have lasted this long, and they're probably timeless for a reason.